Well, let us turn to God's Word this morning, to the book of John. It's not quite right up there. We're looking this morning at John chapter 19 and the first 16 verses of John chapter 19 as we continue to look at the victorious road to Calvary. So John chapter 19, reading from verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers also twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and clothed him in a purple robe. And they kept coming up to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and were slapping his face. Pilate went outside again and said to them, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know I find no grounds for charging him." Then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the chief priests and the temple servants saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate responded, "Take him and crucify him yourselves, since I find no grounds for charging him." "We have a law," the Jews replied to him, "and according to that law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was more afraid than ever. He went back into the headquarters and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus did not give him an answer. So Pilate said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" "You would have no authority over me at all," Jesus answered him, "if it hadn't been given you from above. This is why the one who handed me over to you has the greatest sin." From that moment, Pilate kept trying to release him. But the Jews shouted, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside. He sat down on the judge's seat in a place called the Stone Pavement, in Aramaic Gabbatha. It was the preparation day for the Passover, and it was about noon. Then he told the Jews, "Here is your king." They shouted, "Take him away! Take him away! Crucify him!" Then Pilate said to them, "Should I crucify your king?" "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Then he handed him over to be crucified. May the Lord bless us as we consider this word together this morning. Well, as we continue to look at this victorious road to Calvary, we've seen it's an ironically victorious road to Calvary, because in so many aspects of it, we would under normal circumstances be saying that was defeat. He was being conquered, he was being defeated, and yet all along we've seen how Jesus has been victorious. And this morning we come to the fact that he was victoriously forsaken. Another one of those things. How can you say somebody is forsaken victoriously, and yet Jesus is forsaken in this passage, and he is forsaken victoriously. We've already seen him being forsaken by his disciples as he was arrested in Gethsemane. They all fled. As I've said, yes, John and Peter come back and start following again, but he was forsaken by his disciples. We all know that when he hangs on the cross, he's going to be forsaken by the Father. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Probably the most horrendous thought of him hanging on the cross. Well, here we see him forsaken, and it looks like it's a disaster, but actually it is victorious. We'll see him this morning forsaken by Pilate. We'll see him forsaken for various reasons by the Roman soldiers. We'll see him forsaken by the chief priests and all the temple servants. Disowned and forsaken by all of them, but it is victoriously forsaken, because it's all of it, we must see that it's all part of him laying down his life for his sheep, of his own accord, as he said in John chapter 10. I lay down my life of my own accord. This is the reason the Father loves me, is because I lay down my life for the sheep. That's what he's busy accomplishing, and victoriously accomplishing it, even as they forsake him. In fact, the very fact of them forsaking him is what leads him to the cross. It's because he's forsaken that he ends up on the cross. He is busy about drinking the cup that the Father has given him to drink. If you go back to chapter 18 and verse 11, when he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. And Jesus says, "Put your sword away. Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me?" So victoriously, he goes to the cross, and victoriously he is forsaken by these people. So let's look at him being forsaken in these instances, and forsaken victoriously. First of all, we see him forsaken by Pilate. Here is Pilate, this cruel, corrupt, compromising, conniving coward of a politician. Those are words you can often use about politicians, but Pilate certainly was no exception. He was a cruel man, he was a corrupt man, he was a compromising man. We've seen all of that, we see it again. He was a conniving man, and he was cowardly in terms of his giving Jesus over to be crucified. As I said a few weeks ago, he came to power. He came to be the governor in Judea, mainly because he was married to Caesar Augustus's granddaughter, Claudia. He had started off in the army and had risen slightly through the ranks, but this is where he really came to political power, was through his marriage to Claudia, Julia's daughter, and Augustus Caesar's granddaughter. He's a person who is he doesn't have the courage of his own convictions. He knows Jesus is innocent. As we go through the passage, we see it over and over again. He's repeatedly saying, I don't find any grounds for charging this man. What has he done that is wrong? If you go back to chapter 18 and verse 36, where Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. Sorry, I've got the wrong reference there. Must be verse 38. Yes, verse 38 rather. After he said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, I find no grounds for charging him. If you go to chapter 19 and verse 4, Pilate went outside again and said to them, look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know I find no grounds for charging him. We see it again in verse 6. When the chief priests and the temple servants saw him, they shouted, crucify, crucify. Pilate responded, take him and crucify him yourself, since I find no grounds for charging him. So here he is, he's finding no grounds for charging Jesus, but he doesn't have the courage of his convictions to say, I'm letting him go. You guys have got no reason to hold him, no reason for putting him to death. I'm letting him go. And so he's really a people pleaser who just doesn't have the courage of his own convictions. He'd rather please the people, rather curry favor with them, and the chief priests and the temple servants than do what he knows to be right, to do what he knows to be just. And what do we find? We find him here. He doesn't want to crucify Jesus because he realizes this man is innocent. So he thinks to himself, well, I'll go halfway down. I'll drive a middle path. I'll find a via media, as it were. I'll have him flogged. And that should appease these people. That should satisfy their bloodlust without going all the way of crucifying. And he has him flogged. A really severe thing to have done to a man who you know is innocent. I mean, what are you having him flogged for? Here he comes, you say, I find no grounds for charging him, so what are you flogging him for? Are you flogging him for healing the sick? Are you flogging him for raising the dead? Are you flogging him for feeding 5,000 people? What are you flogging him for? In fact, all he's doing is hoping to appease these people. That's all he's doing. So he takes him and has him flogged. Now, let me just explain something about this flogging. The way they flogged you in those days, the whips, they would make these whips with these strands, and into those strands they would weave pieces of metal and pieces of bone and all kinds of horrendous things, that when they whipped the prisoner, who was then had his back bared to their whipping, when they whipped him, those pieces of metal and bone and thorns and that sort of thing in the whips would tear the flesh. It would rip the flesh off of a person terribly. In fact, they said it was 2 crucifixions. People who were going to be crucified, who were flogged before being crucified, it was as if they had 2 crucifixions. Many of them didn't survive the flogging because it was so severe. Josephus and Cicero and Eusebius write about these floggings, and they describe them in this way. They say that they scourged the person to the point where their veins and arteries were visible, where their bones would be visible, where the viscera would be visible. People, very often they would whip them to the point where their kidneys would be open to sight. That's how severe it was. In fact, when we come, it's just really a fulfillment of prophecy. We read in Psalm 22, Jesus, the Messianic Psalm, Jesus saying, my strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death, for dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me, and they have pierced my hands and feet. Verse 17 of Psalm 22 says, I can count all my bones. They stared and gloated me. They could count his bones because they could see his bones. Isaiah 52, it says, behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. As many were astonished at him, his appearance, listen to this, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and its form beyond that of the children of mankind. As they flogged him to the point where he was virtually not recognizable as human. You know, we got shocked, those who saw the movie. I didn't, but those who went to see the movie The Passion of Christ by Mel Gibson, people came away horrified. They said, oh, it was disgusting. It was just over the top, the gore of it all. I put it to you that Mel Gibson didn't even scratch the surface of what Jesus suffered as he was forsaken by Pilate. Let me forsake him to that. I don't want to, he's innocent, so I don't want to put him to death, but let me forsake him to that. And then they take this crown of thorns and this purple robe, and they make a complete mockery of him. Here is the man, verse 5. Pilate brings him out and says, here's the man. Later he's going to say in verse 14, here's your king. But here he says, here is the man. What he's trying to do is he's trying to get them to be sympathetic towards Jesus. He's trying to get them to just dismiss Jesus. This is just a man, not a king. This is just a man, a pathetic man, not a God. This man is of no threat to you. What do you want to crucify him for? Behold the man. It's a statement of pity and dismissal. Behold the man. What's he to do to you? And so here is Pilate. He is a coward. He's afraid. He's afraid of Caesar, his wife's grandfather. Caesar, the Jews knew this, and Pilate knew it very well, that Caesar was a man who suffered very deeply from his own insecurities. He hid himself away. If he heard of anybody that was rising up in treachery against him, he would have them killed in a heartbeat. And so he's afraid of Caesar, and the Jews actually play up on that. If you don't crucify this man, you're not a friend of Caesar's. And we'll let Caesar know that you're not a friend of his. So he's afraid of them. He's afraid of his wife. Have nothing to do with this innocent man. I've been perplexed all night in a dream about him, so have nothing to do with him. He's afraid of his wife. He's afraid of the crowd. He doesn't want to offend them. He wants to please them. And he's afraid of Jesus. Look at verses 7 to 9. The Jews come and they say to him, "We have a law." The Jews replied to him, "And according to that law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was more afraid than ever. Remember, Jesus had said to him when he asked Jesus earlier about Jesus being a king. And Jesus said to him in verse 36, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." My kingdom's not from here. Now, the Jews say, "Oh, he made himself to be the Son of God." When Pilate hears this, he's more afraid. He goes back in, verse 8, to the headquarters and asks Jesus, "Where are you from? My kingdom's not from here." "Well, where are you from?" Because he's a superstitious man. And Jesus doesn't give him an answer. Jesus is in control here. And so Pilate then says to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? I'm in power here. I'm the one who's got all the power. Don't you know I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" Jesus then comes back and says to him, "You wouldn't have any authority over me," Jesus answered him, "if it hadn't been given you from above. This is why the one who handed me over to you has the greatest sin." Well, Pilate is absolutely shaken at this point in time. So it says in verse 12, "From that moment Pilate kept trying to release him. But the Jews shouted, 'If you release this man, you are not a friend, Caesar's friend. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar.'" Verse 13, "When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside, sat down on the judge's seat in the place called the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the preparation day for the Passover, and it was about noon. He told the Jews, "Here is your king." They shout, "Take him away, crucify him." Pilate said, "Should I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar." The chief priest answered. And so he hands him over to be crucified. Pilate is so fearful. He doesn't know which way to turn. He's caught between a rock and a hard place, and you can see that about the many times that he's in and out of the palace. He's in the palace, he's on the pavement. He's in the palace, he's on the pavement. In and out, in and out. He's like a cuckoo in a cuckoo clock. He's like a flea in a fit. He doesn't know where to go. Look at it. Chapter 18 and verse 29. Pilate came out to them. "What charge do you bring against this man?" In verse 33, Pilate went back in to the headquarters, summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Verse 38. After this he said, After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, I find no grounds for charging him. Chapter 19, verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. Went back in and had him flogged. Verse 4. Pilate went outside again and said to them, look, I'm bringing him out to you. Verse 9. He went back into the headquarters and asked Jesus, where are you from? Verse 13. Again, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside. He's in and out, in and out, in and out, because he is so afraid. Pilate eventually gets to the point where he washes his hands of it. All the way along, he's been wanting to wash his hands of this situation. You judge him, you crucify him, you deal with him. Because you see, Pilate knows what he should do. Pilate knows what is the right thing to do, but he's too cowardly to do it. Doesn't have the courage of his convictions, because the cost to himself would be too high. So what you've got with Pilate is you've got a man who forsakes Jesus out of allegiance to himself. He's forsaken, Jesus is forsaken by Pilate out of allegiance to self at the expense of justice. Allegiance to self at the expense of justice. And I put it to you today that there are still many people who forsake Christ out of allegiance to self at the expense of what is right. They know what is right, but they won't do it because of their allegiance to themselves, and they forsake Christ. And I say to you, we need to examine ourselves and say, I'm not immune from that. Lord, protect me from forsaking you in that way. Secondly, he is forsaken by the soldiers. Look at verses 2 and 3. The soldiers also twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and clothed him in a purple robe. And they kept coming to him and saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and were slapping his face. What you've got here is you've got a group of cruel, anti-Semitic, Jew-hating Romans. That's what they are. And they now take him. They are the ones who mercilessly flog Jesus. They're the ones who so barbarically rip him apart through this flogging. And then they go even further by mocking him and beating him. They put this crown of thorns on his head. They put this purple robe on him. The other Gospels tell us that they put a staff in his hand, a scepter in his hand, setting him up as a king. Isn't it interesting that they then take that staff? The other Gospels say that they take that staff and they hit him on the head with it. They've got this crown of thorns on his head and they hit him on the head with the staff. You can imagine what those thorns are doing to his head at that point in time. But beloved, it carries through a wonderful biblical theme. In Genesis chapter 3, as man sins and God issues the curse, he curses with thorns and thistles. As Jesus wears that crown of thorns, it's another picture of Jesus bearing the curse for us, becoming the curse for us. And here are these foolish Roman soldiers just following one another like a bunch of sheep. They're all just falling in line with what's going on. They're unable to think for themselves. They're blinded to their own cruelty, and they're blinded to their own stupidity at this point in time. Not one of them is prepared to stand against the rest, against the crowd, and say, this is wrong. This is wrong. And so they are busy denying and forsaking Christ, basically out of their hatred and out of peer pressure. Again, what are they flogging him for? For healing the lepers and healing the blind? Raising the widow's son? Are they flogging him because he healed a servant of one of their own centurions? But yet they blindly and cruelly lay into him in this way. Just blind hatred, blind patriotism, and a blind mob mentality. We need to beware of the mob mentality that causes blindness to us. And so here is Jesus forsaken out of loyalty and allegiance to Rome at the expense of basic human compassion. Imagine being in that crowd doing that to Jesus. No compassion whatsoever. He's forsaken at the expense of basic human compassion. And then thirdly, he's forsaken by the chief priests. This group, probably the worst of the lot. Here is this religiously righteous group of people. In verse 28 of chapter 18, they don't go into Pilate's palace because they don't want to be defiled and then unable to eat the Passover. So they religiously are righteous. We're keeping ourselves in the right place religiously, and at the same time they are hypocritically compromising and saying, crucify him. Crucify him. For the Jews to crucify somebody, that was illegal. Crucifixion for the Jews was abhorrent. It was a stench and offensive to them. And yet they calling for his crucifixion. These religiously righteous people, quite happy to go against their own standards and have him crucified. In verse 7, they say, we have a law. We are so fastidious about our law. We have a law. We are righteously. You can imagine them saying, we are standing up for righteousness at this point in time. Here is a man who's calling himself God. It's blasphemy. We are doing the right thing. We must have this man put to death. We have a law that says that a person must die because he's made himself equal to God. There's a self-righteousness here. There is a self-justifying here. How easily religious people can do exactly that and hypocritically be forsaking the absolute truth. You see, to them, their religion was more important than the truth. Jesus had performed all these miracles to prove that he is the Son of God. It was clear, and they forsake him rather than stand up for the truth. They're a bunch of manipulators. Look at verse 12 when Pilate is objecting. Verse 12, from that moment, Pilate kept trying to release him, but the Jews shouted, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. They are hypocrites. We're on Caesar's side, suddenly they're saying. We're standing up for Caesar, and you are not, so you need to come into line here. They're blackmailing him, basically. They're manipulating him and blackmailing him. Verses 14 and 15. They're lying. They're a bunch of two-faced hypocrites. What we read there. It was the preparation day for the Passover, and it was about noon. Then he told the Jews, here is your king. They shouted, take him away, crucify him. Pilate said to them, should I crucify your king? And now listen to these words. We have no king but Caesar. Here are these religiously righteous Jews who should be saying, we have no king but God in heaven. Or what are they saying? We have no king but Caesar. This was an offense for the Jews. This was abhorrent to the Jews. We have no king but Caesar. They're united in it. They back one another up in the situation. They bolster one another in this situation. They are basically blinded to the point of mob blindness in their hypocrisy. And they united, first of all, in fear of losing their power and their position. If you go back to chapter 11, when Lazarus was raised from the dead, that was what they were fearing. If this man keeps on doing these miracles, everybody's going to leave us and follow him, and our power is going to be taken away. The Romans will take our power away. They don't want to lose their power and their position. Chapter 11, verses 47 and 48, the chief priests and Pharisees convened the Sanhedrin and were saying, what are we going to do, since this man is doing many signs? If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. That's what they're afraid of. Chapter 12 and verses 9 to 11. The large crowd of Jews learned that he was there. They came not only because of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, the one who had been raised from the dead. The chief priest had decided to kill Lazarus also because he was the reason many Jews were deserting them and believing in Jesus. It's all about their position, their power, their being raised up. And so what are they doing? They are forsaking Jesus out of allegiance to power and position at the expense of truth. We'll sacrifice the truth as long as we keep our position. And so Jesus is forsaken by all of these people for these different reasons and in these different ways. But I want to say to you, by way of contrast, he, Jesus, the forsaken, is the one who does not forsake. He doesn't forsake. And so I want you to see the beauty of being unforsaken. Jesus said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And he is the one who has not forsaken anyone. He did not forsake his Father. He didn't forsake his Father's plan. He didn't forsake the covenant of salvation. He didn't forsake his disciples. He did not, and he has not forsaken any of his elect. He does not forsake, and he never will. And this is the assurance that you and I can have today. I will never leave you nor forsake you. He always has, always will remain steadfast, loyal, and true. True to his covenants, true to his Father, true to his people. All at the expense of himself. Others were forsaking him at the expense of self and expense of truth, the expense of justice, the expense of human compassion. Jesus remains unforsaking at the expense of himself. Beloved, I want to say to you, that is mercy and that is grace, because everybody else deserved to be forsaken. And yet, he has remained true. So in conclusion, beloved, I want you to see this, that Jesus even was forsaken, as I said earlier, by the Father. And the Father forsook his only begotten Son out of allegiance to the church, out of allegiance to you and I, out of allegiance to his elect, at the expense of his own Son. God so loved the world, he gave his Son. And here we are, those who are helpless. The Father sends Christ for them. While we were helpless, Christ died for the ungodly. While we were sinners, Christ died for us. While we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son. The Father forsook the Son for us. And beloved, that's called grace. I remember very early in my Christian walk, somebody saying, the word grace means this: God's riches at Christ's expense. God's riches at Christ's expense. That's grace. Grace is so much more than that, but it's certainly nothing less than that. And this morning, that's what we're seeing. The riches of God being poured out on us at Christ's expense, who does not forsake us. He was forsaken by all for us. He was forsaken so that we might be redeemed. He was forsaken so that we may be reconciled. He was forsaken so that we may be forgiven. He was forsaken so that we may be adopted. Praise my soul, the King of heaven. To his feet thy tribute bring. Ransomed, healed, restored, forgiven. Who like thee his praise should sing? Forsaken for you, so that he doesn't forsake you and me. Praise his name. Let's stand and sing.